Welcome to the CultureLab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
When you're at work, it's that performance that you need to be delivering from the moment you sit down to the moment that you leave. And often people are hungry throughout that period. And often because they need to be delivering, they're eating at their desk, which means that their body actually isn't digesting the food that they're eating because your body doesn't actually realize you're eating. And that means that you have negative impacts from that. So my recommendation about calming down and slowing down, just those 2 minutes. And if you want to pick some points in the day, my suggestion is to have that minute or those 2 minutes each time before you eat. And that can almost be a trigger. So, all right, I'm starving. I'm about to have lunch. I'm going to take a minute, breathe deeply, and just do a mental check-in with my body as to where I am. And that will help prime the body to be more in that rest and digest mode than the stress mode, which is fight and flight, because you can't be in both at the same time.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 125 of the CultureLab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrain, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrain connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrain. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. And here is a message from our friends Frances Fry and Anne Morris about their fantastic new TED podcast.
Hi, I'm Frances Fry.
And I'm Anne Morris.
And we are the hosts of a new TED podcast called Fixable.
We've helped leaders at some of the world's most competitive companies solve all kinds of problems.
On our show, we'll pull back the curtain and give you the type of honest, unfiltered advice we usually reserve for top executives.
Maybe you have a coworker with boundary issues, or you want to know how to inspire and motivate your team.
No problem is too big or too small. Give us a call and we'll help you solve the problems you're stuck on. Find Fixable wherever you listen to podcasts.
As I'm recording this, I'm still experiencing something that's referred to as leisure sickness or the let-down effect. It's when you finally take a well-deserved break after a long period of hustle and stress, and you immediately get a cold. When I posted about it on LinkedIn, I realized that it's super common. We don't rest enough. We don't sleep enough. We don't distress and recharge enough, and we don't eat well enough. And yet, somehow, we expect that we will be able to perform at work. My guest today is Dana Chapman, and she's a leading mental health and wellness expert who specializes in the gut-brain axis. In this episode, Dana helps us understand the role that stress, genetics, poor nutrition, and our lifestyles all have an impact on our mental health and how we can make small, effective, and achievable changes in each of these areas. So with no further ado, meet Dana.
My name is Dana Chapman. I am a nutritional therapist specializing in the link between the gut and the brain, so specializing in the gut-brain axis to help support and promote good mental well-being.
Dana, thank you for joining us today. And I'm really excited because, as you know, this show focuses mainly on company culture. And our audience consists predominantly of people who take care of people and who want to find new, better ways of achieving peak performance without burnout. And I think in this context, particularly, I can't think of a better person to talk to. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Aga. I am delighted to be here. So thank you for having me.
Dana, there's one question I ask all of our guests. I would love to know, what were the early cultural influences in your life? How did you grow up? And how did it shape you as a person?
I love this question, and I love telling the story of where I grew up and how I grew up. I grew up in Africa, actually, in a country called Zimbabwe. And I grew up on a farm. I feel very privileged. Knowing the information that I do now, I feel even more privileged that I grew up on a farm in Africa, in Zimbabwe. The way that that culturally has shaped me as a person, if anyone has ever been to Zimbabwe, you know that the people there are very friendly, very welcoming, and we believe in that sense of community. And I think in today's busy lifestyles, we can very easily lose that sense of community. But when you think about our health and our mental health and the support that we actually need in our lives these days, that culture is very important. So that is still very important to me now, even though I don't live close to family. That togetherness and that sense of community is so important through every stage of life. And I think is so important for mental health as well.
Absolutely. And I think there's plenty of evidence that connection and community are one of the key pillars of health.
Yes.
So it's really interesting that you bring that up, and I'm keen to discuss this as we continue with our conversation. How did that sense of community in your early days growing up shaped and informed your professional life? Because I know that, and this has been a consistent pattern throughout the interviews that I carry out with people, that there are always traces of these early days in how we show up in our professional lives as well.
A sense of the community, knowing that you don't have to face life on your own. And I think where I am now in my career is very much I work for myself. And so you need to draw on others for their strengths. What I miss most about the corporate world is that you don't have that team around you. But drawing on your community in times of where you need them is really important to support your health, to help reduce stress. That sense of community when I was growing up has very much shaped the sense of community that I try create now in my life. I've got young children, and when you have young children, I think you know that you need the support of other mothers who have young children because of the numerous activities that they've got. But also in my professional life, that sense of community is very important because I don't have others to learn from other than from my community. Working on your own, you need to go out into that community to continue that learning, because learning is always best done within that community. Having lots of different people's experiences and exposures and opinions helps shape and form the best opinion and the best advice that you can give to others as well, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. As you know, we run a community for culture leaders exactly because of that reason. It can really be quite lonely for people. I think especially in the people function, especially in companies that grow rapidly, because usually the teams there are still quite small. Sometimes you are on your own, or maybe you have one more colleague in your department, and the expectations from what you are going to be able to deliver to the organizations are usually huge. And so you really breathe your own fumes all the time. And people truly crave that community that can help them gain a window into what's happening out there, what are other organizations doing, and learn from each other. And it's such a powerful way, I find, to really redefine how we work, what we do. So I really resonate with what you've shared here. Dana, I'm really curious. How does one find themselves in a place in their career where they start getting super curious about that undeniably vital connection between self-care and professional excellence? Because a lot of your work is actually in that sweet spot of these two things. So what made you go down that rabbit hole and start exploring?
It's a very good question. And I think it's the way that my career has evolved. So I haven't always been a nutritional therapist. I was in the corporate world and I did work for one of the big four consulting firms in the UK and in South Africa, actually. And it was through my studies. Actually, I started studying when I was still working in the corporate world. And so both kind of informed each other. I was learning so much within my studies in nutrition science about how the body can affect the brain, specifically the gut and that gut brain axis. And I was just fascinated that you can help support your cognitive health and cognitive function through the foods that you eat, through your lifestyle, through managing your stress. And that's all that I was learning about, actually. So after having my second son, it was time for me to start doing my dissertation, and mental health was being spoken about a lot more in the corporate space. And that's actually when I left the corporate world and started working in the world of nutritional therapy and nutrition science. And so I started to delve more into that link between the gut and the brain. And I decided for my dissertation that there was this really big gap in the corporate market speaking about mental health, but not speaking about how you can actively improve your own mental health by the things that you eat, but also by your lifestyle and lifestyle choices. So that's why I decided to study through my dissertation the link between stress, gut health, and mental health, because I really felt that there was a gap in the market. A lot of people were speaking, like I say, about mental health, but they were speaking about, let's bring in some meditation, or let's bring in some talking therapies, or let's bring in some yoga within the organization. And all of those are great, but you're missing a key fundamental area, something that people are doing every day, 3 times a day, if not more, is they are eating, they are fueling themselves. And it's such a big part of our health, our cognitive health, our mental health, that I think the corporate world is still missing these days.
Definitely. And not only the corporate world, I think generally the world is missing that focus and understanding of that connection. I'm really keen to explore the gut brain connection that you have explored in such depth and that you work on with a lot of your clients. So let's go there. I think, especially in the case of the so-called knowledge workers, I find that we often end up treating ourselves almost as a brain in a jar, and we rarely ask ourselves, what does my body need so that I can do my best work? A question that people probably would like me to ask you is, how can they understand, first of all, and leverage that relationship between their bodies and mental sharpness and performance at work?
It's about people slowing down, because I think if people slow down and actually feel what their body feels like and how that impacts their mental health, cognition, and performance at work, people will very soon realize that when they are not feeling very well in their body, that they can't function optimally within their brain and within their day as well. So I think it's the slowing down and the actual taking notice of how my body is feeling and how that impacts my brain and my brain function.
Of course, rationally, we all know that we need to slow down, but you are very familiar with cultures where people don't feel like they can slow down. And also where they don't even know how to do it. So do you have any practical tips for us how to do it, especially in an environment that is very demanding, when you juggle a lot of things and expectations from what you are going to be able to deliver within 24 hours are really, really high?
Agreed. And I think it's about habit. And I don't think it actually takes that long. All it takes is a minute or 2 minutes to sit down and to breathe. I always recommend closing my eyes, being in a space where you can close your eyes, or you can concentrate on, if you're sitting at your desk and you don't want anybody else to know, staring at a point in your laptop and just breathing and almost doing a mental check throughout the body. And a minute or 2 minutes is all that you need. And like you say, it's the go, go, go of when you're at work. It's that performance that you need to be delivering from the moment you sit down to the moment that you leave. And often people are hungry throughout that period. And often because they need to be delivering, they're eating at their desk, which means that their body actually isn't digesting the food that they're eating, because your body doesn't actually realize you're eating. And that means that you have negative impacts from that. So my recommendation about calming down and slowing down, just those 2 minutes. And if you want to pick some points in the day, my suggestion is to have that minute or those 2 minutes each time before you eat. And that can almost be a trigger. So, all right, I'm starving. I'm about to have lunch. I'm going to take a minute, breathe deeply, and just do a mental check-in with my body as to where I am. And that will help prime the body to be more in that rest and digest mode than the stress mode, which is fight and flight, because you can't be in both at the same time. So it doesn't take long. It's a minute or 2 minutes. And the best way to build in a new habit is to tag it onto something that you're already doing. So is it the morning coffee that you want to do it at? Or is it, I'm starving, it's lunchtime, I'm going to eat. This is a great time to do it. And maybe start off with just once a day. But that check-in will really help you identify. And hopefully with small and achievable goals, with doing that once, you realize the benefits, and that gives you the motivation to do it again and again.
Yeah, I think it's extremely doable, and anyone can take a few seconds or a minute to breathe and start noticing how their body is feeling. And I like this advice of doing it before your meals, because as you say, you are basically resetting your nervous system and activating and triggering your parasympathetic system, so that, as you say, you enter that state of rest and digest, rather than being in a go, go, go mode that basically completely suppresses your digestive system. So you might be eating, but actually the digestive system is not kicking in and doing the work that it's supposed to be doing, because your body thinks that you are being attacked by a lion or something like that. And obviously that's more important than digesting. That's a super doable tip. We start with that, but what happens at mealtime? I know that this is the main focus of your work, nutrition, and how nutrition impacts the way we feel and the way our brain feels. And as you've mentioned, you look particularly with particular interest at the gut-brain axis. Why is that important? Why should we be thinking what's happening in our gut?
Because of the gut-brain axis. So researchers now developed a lot more into the gut-brain axis and the impact that the gut has on the brain. So the gut-brain axis, a lot of people can acknowledge that that is the vagus nerve. There are other signaling molecules that are involved as well, but the communication mainly goes through this vagus nerve. 20% of signals go from brain to gut, and actually 80% of the signals go from gut to brain. So the gut can control our stress response, so how stressed we feel. But the gut has been shown through the research now that it has a really large impact on our cognitive functioning, but also on our emotional health and emotional well-being as well. So we need to start paying attention to this gut-brain axis because of those three main factors. The fact that it impacts our stress response. So how stressed we feel or how well we are able to respond to the stress that we have in our lives, our cognitive function. And most of this gut-brain axis signaling is done by the gut microbiome. So, and if we have an imbalanced gut microbiome, we know that that affects our cognitive function. So a lot of people with an imbalanced gut microbiome might feel things like brain fog and inability to concentrate for very long times. So that's all your cognitive function type stuff. And then the third is mental health. So whether you feel happy or whether you feel overwhelmed, sad, and or depressed and anxious. So I think those are the three main areas that I would say these are the reasons why we need to be looking at the gut, because it's that 80% signaling that the gut doesn't only control the brain, but it also controls our stress response and how we are able to react to the stress that we do have in our lives.
Okay, so let's unpack some of the stuff that you have just shared with us. What is vagus nerve and why should we be paying attention to it?
But the vagus nerve attaches from the base of the brain and it wanders throughout the body. So the word vagus comes from the word wandering. It wanders throughout the body through the neck and then wanders further throughout the body as well. It attaches to our adrenal glands and it attaches to our gut. A lot of the signaling then from the brain to the gut goes via this vagus nerve. So if we see a tiger, that vagus nerve is activated to say activate the stress response. So that vagus nerve will signal to the adrenal glands, which is what produces our adrenaline and our cortisol, to secrete adrenaline to enable us to get away. And it signals to the gut as well. That signaling can go back up the vagus nerve as well. So that's really what the vagus nerve is. Because of the stresses that we are exposed to these days, often the vagus nerve can get stuck in what we call an always on mode. So because your vagus nerve is so used to sending the signal that I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, it can get stuck in that stress mode. And the vagus nerve can then be used, or exercises against the vagus nerve can be used to reduce that or to get back to what we call vagal tone, where the body actually realizes when it should be activated and when it should respond to stress, rather than just being on that constant activation stress mode.
Well, it sounds like a very desirable state to get it unstuck. So I definitely like us to explore how do we do that. But before we go there, let's talk about microbiome. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is it and why is it important?
Multiple reasons as to why it's important. What is it? So the gut microbiome refers to the trillions of bacteria that we have living within our large intestine. So that is where we have the biggest variety of bacteria within the body. We also have a skin microbiome and oral microbiome, nasal cavity microbiome. So we have these microbiomes all over our body. The microbiome refers to the bacteria, fungi, archaea, and viruses, as well as parasites that live within this large intestine. We need that bacteria because that bacteria helps us digest our food, but it also creates some vitamins and minerals. And more importantly, it creates things such as short chain fatty acids. And those short chain fatty acids are important for that signaling to the brain and important for our mental health as well. So creation of our neurotransmitters. So those are just some of the ways that the gut microbiome is important. We know that 70% of the immune system is within the gut, and that comes from the gut microbiome as well. So the gut microbiome is important for immunity, important for helping break down our food and therefore release the nutrients from that food. They create the short chain fatty acids that help support mental health and help support regeneration of that gut lining. And it creates some of our vitamins and minerals as well.
So I understand that there are good bacteria and bad bacteria. And basically, when we talk about gut microbiome, we want to strike the right balance and have predominantly the so-called good bacteria that is going to help us achieve all these benefits that you've talked about. Okay, so let's get a little bit practical about those things, because I'm sure that people are listening to this and it sounds like you can get so much benefits from taking care of your vagus nerve and microbiome. But the big question is, in our busy lives, what do we do? What is the right protocol to get to a place where we balance those things and make them work for us instead of against us?
There's never one quick fix. So a probiotic or a pill is not going to help support it. And it's not just about food either, because stress has a large role to play on our gut microbiome. So stress can kill off beneficial bacteria within the gut microbiome. But exactly what you said, I like to refer to it as beneficial and potentially non-beneficial bacteria, because all the bacteria within your gut lives in symbiosis. And we need enough of the beneficial bacteria to keep the potentially non-beneficial bacteria in check. But there are multiple things that we can do these days to help support our gut microbiome. And yes, a lot of that can come from food as well. We know that diets very high in fiber are very beneficial for the gut microbiome, because the gut microbiome like to eat fiber, and they are like us. They need to eat to survive. So a diet high in fiber is really important. So here you're thinking obviously fruit and vegetables, but I also like to include things like nuts and seeds are very high in fiber and very important for feeding that gut microbiome, as well as things like beans and lentils. And then of course you're thinking about your whole grains as well. A diet high in diversity is also very important for the gut microbiome, because again, different bacteria like to feed off different foods. So if you're eating a wide variety of food, you are helping feed all of the different species of bacteria within your gut. And here you're thinking, well, the recommendation here is 30 different plant foods in a week. Now, that's not necessarily...
What?
Yes.
30. Wow. In a week.
You think that it's really difficult, but if you took a handful of nuts, instead of having a handful of almonds, you had a handful of mixed nuts, then you would see that already, instead of having one variety of plant foods, you would have 4 or 5 varieties of plant foods just in that one handful of nuts. If you were having a salad, instead of just having lettuce in that salad, you could have a bag of mixed leaves, and those mixed leaves could have 9 or 10 different varieties in them. Or you could go get a spinach, watercress, and rocket salad bag, for example. So already, instead of just having one variety, you would have 3 just in one bowl. So it's about making those small changes and looking for the variety. So I find in first world countries, it's wonderful that we can get the same food throughout the whole year, but that's not necessarily beneficial for our health or for our gut or our gut microbiome. So what the best thing to do would be is to eat seasonally and to change the foods that you're eating from week to week as well, because again, that's going to give you the different variety. So instead of having a shopping list and putting the same things on that shopping list every week, it's about mixing them up. It's about thinking, how can we bring in some seasonality here? How can we bring in some differences here? It's about going to the shops and thinking, oh, that's a new fruit and or vegetable. Why don't I try that this week? Because all of that is going to be increasing the variety of food that you eat, and therefore increasing the variety of food that your gut microbiome has and eats as well.
So I've already identified something that I've been doing wrong, because I do have a list, and I think I get stuck on recipes that I love, and I don't think that we're getting our 30 different plant-based foods in our diet at home. So I actually love that approach of going to a grocery store and just looking around what fruits and veggies are in season and becoming a little bit more adventurous with what you are shopping for. I think especially for folks who enjoy cooking and experimenting with new foods, that sounds like an enticing idea to bring in more new and varied foods into the diet. Do you have any other similar hacks like that? Because that sounds really doable and easy. Are there any other things that are quite easy that people can do?
Yes, there's another food that I hadn't got onto quite yet that's important for helping support the gut and the gut microbiome, which we don't often do these days, is including fermented foods in your diet. And again, having different fermented foods, it will help increase the variety of often plant-based foods, but it'll help feed the gut microbiome as well. It helps inoculate the gut with bacteria because it is a fermented food, so you're eating the bacteria. So you can do it with cheeses. Raw cheeses especially are amazing because they are fermented food. And again, they are a different variety of food that you can be eating. You can do it with, one week you might buy a sauerkraut, the next week you might buy a kimchi. And in those, again, you've got different varieties, or you might have 2 bottles in the fridge, and one week you might concentrate on the sauerkraut, and the next week you might concentrate then on the kimchi and having that with each meal. Nuts and seeds, I find, are another great way, another great hack. I often like to throw in a handful of nuts and or seeds into a salad. And again, you can have a variety, especially for women. Something like seed cycling can be beneficial for the menstrual cycle. So in that way, you can change up the seeds that you're having. Seed cycling normally is, the first 2 weeks is a tablespoon of pumpkin seeds and a tablespoon of ground flax seeds. And then the second 2 weeks is a tablespoon of sesame seeds. I like to use tahini, and then a tablespoon of sunflower seeds. So again, that's 4 different varieties that you would be having within a month, but potentially 2 different varieties that you would be having in a week. And then maybe throwing a handful of mixed nuts instead of a handful of almonds or pistachios into the mix as well.
I love that. So we talked about the foods that help, but I'm sure that there are things that we should avoid. What are they?
Processed food. So any processed food is very devoid of nutrients, but it's also very devoid of fiber. You're missing out on an opportunity to feed your gut microbiome. Often those foods are high in sugar as well, and sugar feeds the potentially pathogenic bacteria within the gut and the gut microbiome. So sugar can change the landscape of the gut microbiome in a way that you are at an increased risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So those foods are a best to stay away from. So anything processed. So for example, a whole grain rice instead of a white rice is a nice, good switch up there.
What about sodas? What about that? Because I think a lot of people drink diet sodas trying to avoid sugar. What do you have to say about that?
The diet drinks actually have a worse impact on the gut microbiome than a full sugar drink does. So there have been studies that have shown that constant use of sweeteners has a detrimental impact on the gut microbiome.
That's, I think, a big misconception that I see a lot, that people try to avoid sugar. We know, I think the majority of people know that sugar is not good for you. So they'll go for artificially sweetened drinks or food, thinking that actually it's doing them good. But it turns out that it's probably actually working against the good bacteria that we have in our gut. So something important to keep in mind. Okay, so I think we've given our listeners a lot of practical ideas around how they can make some changes in the way they eat, in what they eat, and in how they eat in order to nurture the right microbiome and help their vagus nerve. Are there any other things that we can be doing for our brains that maybe don't have so much to do with our gut that people could weave into their daily routine?
We know that exercise is good for cognitive health and cognitive function, specifically exercise such as yoga. And we know meditation has that effect as well. And often it is because those activities help reduce the amount of stress that we have in our bodies. And when we are stressed, it's the prefrontal cortex, so the front part of our brain, that is impacted. And that affects our decision making and our cognitive function. So incorporating exercise into their daily routine is very beneficial, especially if it is something like yoga or meditation. Not that meditation is an exercise, But there's a lot of research nowadays being done on the beneficial impacts of time out in nature. I love that one because it is beneficial for helping set our circadian rhythm, so our day night cycles, and keeping our bodies ticking along at the correct pace and time during the day, helping improve sleep as well. And obviously, sleep is another great one. We know that our cognitive function declines when we don't have the correct amount of sleep.
I've heard that if you had 2 bad nights or even 1 bad night, I think it impacts our cognitive ability as much as 2 or 3 drinks would, which is scary
Yes.
to think
Yes.
about. It
Yes.
really is. And I honestly can say that I experience that personally. If I don't sleep well, the next day is pretty rough. And I definitely see that impact. These were super useful tips, Dana, around what we can do, how we can tweak the way we eat and what we do in our lives in order to take better care of our bodies so that we can perform better at work, especially cognitively. But the thing is, people know a lot of this stuff already. We might not know all the details about what feeds the good gut bacteria, but we know the basic principles. And yet there is a big gap usually between what we know and what we do. And I think particularly at work, it seems like the environment at work is not always helping. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts around what companies can do to help people embrace practices that are conducive to well-being, mental well-being and physical well-being?
We've spoken a lot about food, and organizations often have a canteen within their office, or they have vending machines within the office as well. And even though it might seem very military not to be able to have chocolate bars within the vending machine, I think that the organization will be benefiting their employees if that vending machine was filled with really beneficial food for their employees' bodies, minds, and brains and guts. So I think in those areas, having that culture of you are surrounded by really nutritious food that's going to feed your body and your mind is one of the best ways that organizations can help support their employees. And I always say it's through knowledge as well. So if your employees know and are being fed that information constantly about what is beneficial for you and what are the benefits for your body and brain from eating these certain foods, then I find it's much easier for everybody to follow suit as well.
Yeah, and once you have the experience of an altered state, when you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I actually don't need to feel like that after lunch. I can still feel energetic, right, after I eat. It's encouraging. And especially when you start noticing, which means being more mindful about how you feel. Going back to your initial point, tune into your body and just notice how your body feels and what it might need so that you can deliver this project or whatever it is that you are focusing on. That's wonderful. I wonder, what are your thoughts around flexibility in the workplace? These days, there is this whole conversation about going back to the office. I think traditionally we know that spending a whole day in the office can be a roadblock, let's put it this way, sometimes to people's well-being. Starts from a long commute, and then you are in the space where maybe, as you say, you don't have access to healthy food. You sit down for the whole day. What are your thoughts on that? And is there any research that shows what's the impact of flexibility, remote work, hybrid work versus in-office work when it comes to our physical and mental well-being?
Yes, very good question. And I haven't delved into the research specifically about the health impacts and cognitive impacts of being home based or office based or a hybrid of the two. I think everyone noticed that through COVID, a lot more people were spending more time preparing their food, which, if it gives you joy, it's much better to have that flexibility of perhaps sometimes in the office, but sometimes from home, because then you can prepare those meals from scratch. You can have your scrambled eggs in the morning rather than grabbing a croissant close to the office. So it's about having that. If you're using your flexible time, if you're using the time that you're working from home to be able to prepare those meals, then I think that's where the benefit lies. And that's where the where we can expand the benefit of either hybrid or home working is let's use your kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes total sense to me. And at the same time, I think there's been research that shows that during the pandemic, people's mental health suffered. And I think it was predominantly because people missed connections and community. And so there needs to be a balance there, I suppose, because especially we know this from research for younger generations that really rely on those social interactions at work because they haven't developed a very strong social network yet. Maybe they don't have families. It changes with time and with age when you have your own kids and a very tight knit group of friends. But for young people, very often the workplace is actually a place where they cultivate their friendships and where their social connections come from. So it's a really interesting conversations because definitely community and social connections are one of the pillars of good health, as you've mentioned. So something to ponder, I suppose, for our listeners. How do you strike that right balance for your organization? Dana, I know that you work with companies helping them out when it comes to people finding better ways of approaching their physical and mental health, especially via nutrition. Can you talk to us a little bit about what a professional like you can bring in terms of value into an organization?
It goes back to that missing link that I was speaking about earlier, where we are wanting to educate our employees or support them in their mental health. And I find that when you know how your body works and what it needs to work at its best or to work optimally, that is where the real change lies. Yes, we're told to eat 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, but unless you understand the reason why, it's very difficult to make those changes. And that's where I come in within organizations. A lot of organizations also have apps or platforms which help promote and support employee well-being. But the research shows that within those organizations, the amount of take up of using those apps or of using those platforms is very low. And it's because we're missing that education piece. And that's where I slip in. It's that education about why we should be exercising, why we should be eating well, that helps provide the reasons why somebody needs to change. And like you say, once they start making those changes and noticing the impact, you are much more motivated to carry on that way. And you realize I didn't have to feel like that for so long. I think it's also about the education. So many people, especially in the work environment, suffer from gut health and gut related conditions. And they've been to the doctor and they've had the tests. And yes, they might have a diagnosis of IBS or they might be sent away told that nothing is wrong with them. But often there very much is something wrong. The GPs and the medical system as it is isn't supportive of helping acknowledge or know what the reasons are that those people are having those gut related symptoms and how to fix them. And again, that's where I come in because the gut plays such a large role in how we feel. And yet so many people are still living with those gut related symptoms because that's just the way they are now. They've learned to live with it. But it's about knowing that everyone can achieve optimal health. It's just the knowledge as to how you get there and how that relates specifically to you. So it's really that knowledge gap that I'm trying to plug within the wellness space.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And I think what organizations can also do when they work with individuals like you or offer people other perks, like, I don't know, unlimited PTO or platforms, et cetera, is I find that the role of leaders and managers is so incredibly important in having conversations with their teams and asking them what their experience has been using those resources that are made available to employees. Because very often people will have these things at their fingertips, but there's so much pressure to deliver results at work and so much focus is being placed on that and zero on how are you taking care of yourself. And I find, in weekly meetings, in quarterly meetings, you'll sit down, you look at the goals of the last quarter. What have you done to accomplish your goals? But there is very little conversation about how are you doing on your well-being goals and how have the resources that we've made available been helping you to be healthier. I think that it's really important for us to encourage leaders to have these conversations with their employees, because giving people the tools, it really doesn't equal using the tools, or even having an opportunity to work with an individual like you. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will reach out to you, work with you, and get the benefits that they could get from it. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I'm mindful of time and I want us to shift gears and move to our rapid fire questions.
Okay.
All right, let's go for it. So at Culture Brain, the company that I run, we are on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. And I'm curious, what would be your number one tip to bring more fun into the workplace?
Togetherness, doing things together.
What are the signs that a company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
When people can't get along, when there's lack of communication and communication breakdowns.
Do you admire any companies for their culture? And if yes, why?
I don't have experience with very many, but the one that I do is PwC. I think they do really uphold the culture within the organization. Everyone that works there mostly are happy, and they seem to take employees' well-being into account, as well as the results and growth within the organization as well. So I think they are a good example.
Are there any books? And I don't mean necessarily books on leadership or culture, but any books that you believe our listeners would benefit from?
Very good question. The one that comes to mind is Breathe, actually. All about how we can use our breath to control our stress response.
For sure, very powerful. I'll check it out. And final question to wrap it all up. If people are inspired to learn more about you, about your work, how they can work with you, what would be the best online places to reach out to you or simply to read about what you do?
Thank you so much, Aga. I do have a website, which is dc-nutrition.co.uk. I love to write some top tips on LinkedIn, so do come over and find me there. Dana Chapman, I am on there. And I work with individuals and organizations. So on my website, I do have a contact me form. I will happily respond to any LinkedIn messages as well if people either want to think about the work that I do on an individual basis or on a company basis. But my website does quite cover my services in both of those areas as well.
Amazing. So you will be able to find the link to the website in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in and being with us for this conversation. And Dana, thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge and expertise so generously.
Thank you so much, Aga. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the CultureLab podcast. And this is the CultureLab team.
Anis Enlabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for spending time with Dana and me on this episode of the CultureLab podcast. If you found this insightful, inspiring, or useful, and I'm guessing you did since you're still here, do me a solid, take a few seconds to share this episode and maybe have a chat with someone about what you learned. Because when podcasts like this spark conversations and those conversations turn into actions, that's when we start making real changes in the workplace together. And if you're looking to dig deeper into these topics and connect with others who are shaping the culture within their organizations, consider joining Culture Brain, especially now because we are offering our listeners a 25% discount on the annual fees. To take advantage of this opportunity, mention this code when applying, CB25. And to find out more and apply, head over to tinyurl.com/culturebrain. The link is in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the CultureLab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.